Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Rutland City's Forum on Water Disinfection. This is the first of two forums that will be held on this subject. I am Alderman Joe Barbagallo, and I will be the moderator for this evening. This event is being recorded by PEG TV and will be broadcast on our local access channel in the future. A schedule of where it can be seen can be found on the PEG TV bulletin board. As with any forum, there must be rules. The session will last no longer than 90 minutes. After the members of the panel speak, the public will be permitted to ask one question each. This will go on until we either run out of questions. As you ask your question, I ask that you identify yourself and your place of residence. Please wait until I bring the microphone to you before you ask your question. We will stop all questions 10 minutes before the end of the session to allow the panel to offer closing comments. If you do not get a chance to ask your question, you may go to the site listed on the bottom of your agenda sheet and submit it in writing, call the number listed, or come back to the next session on November 20th and ask your question. The panel will see to it that your question is answered. I ask you to respect both your fellow members of the public and members of the panel when asking your question, and also when they are being answered. Outbursts will not be tolerated. Our panel tonight are experts in this field. At this time, I will ask Mark Youngstrom to introduce himself and the members of this panel. They will then speak to their area of expertise. I will then entertain questions. Mark.
Hello, I'm Mark Youngstrom. I'm the interim city engineer. And I think the best way to start is just why are we here? And a little background. Rutland City has always received its water almost from the very beginning from Mendon Brook. And up until 1910, the city users drank water essentially straight from the brook. Went into a little reservoir, a couple of little reservoirs over the years, but essentially drank brook water. And whatever came out of the large watershed in Mendon, across the farm fields and the active farms, went into the brook and into the city water supply. And that was an acceptable water supply back in the 1800s. Up until about 1910, when there was a typhoid outbreak in Rutland City, and it was known that a lot of the waterborne illnesses were caused by the water. So the city started adding chlorine gas, well, first a bleaching powder, and then chlorine gas. And that was fantastic. If you look at the records, waterborne diseases just dropped like a rock down to virtually zero at that time. Now, up until 1995, that's essentially what controlled the water quality in Rutland City. Brook water into an open reservoir, and then chlorinated and right to your tap. Now the chlorine solved waterborne diseases related to bacteria, and which is what most of the waterborne diseases come from. However, the federal EPA started to get, back in the 90s, the EPA started getting very concerned about pathogens in the water that chlorine was less effective in dealing with, like Giardia, Cryptosporidium, those type of things, viruses. And so they required that all water systems that got their water from surface water put in filtration. There are some exceptions, New York City, Boston, and all that, but essentially Burlington, anybody who got water from Lake Champlain, any of the rivers in Vermont, all had to put in filtration plants. And so that's when Rutland City, 1995, they built the slow sand water filtration plant, which does an excellent job in removing bacteria. Virtually all bacteria removed just through that process. So then you think, well, why do we bother chlorinating? Well, bacteria can re-emerge in the 70 miles of water mains that are throughout the city. So you need this residual chlorine in the water to keep the system bacteria free. Well, also in the 1990s, researchers started to look at the various reactions that chlorine has with other compounds in the water. And surface waters have a bunch of compounds that we all just label as dissolved organic compounds, which are the compounds that are left from decaying vegetation, that type of thing. You're not going to see it in the water. It's not turbidity per se, but it's just the compounds that are there. They're organic compounds. And when chlorine comes in contact with those organic compounds, they form other compounds, two families of which are trihalomethanes and haloacedic acids. And those compounds at a high enough level are concerning as far as potentially causing cancer, reproductive health, and some other issues. So therefore, they became regulated. And there are maximum contaminant limits associated with those. Rutland City doesn't have a problem with trihalomethanes. However, there has been an on and off challenge with haloacedic acids. The slow sand filter does remove some of the dissolved organic material, but it's not designed to remove those kind of very soluble compounds. And so for the past 20 years or so, there's been an on and off challenge of dealing with haloacedic acids. As seasonally they go up, they go down. Sometimes the city has thought, okay, we're below the MCL. Other times, no, we're above the MCL. If you're above it enough in enough locations, then you start getting in trouble with the state. Some of you may remember we were exactly here just before Hurricane Irene, trying to make this same decision of what's next. But then Hurricane Irene came, and what did it do? It scoured the entire watershed. All the vegetation, the streamside vegetation, the vegetation on the bottom of the stream, and all the tributary streams in Mendon Brook are all back down to gravel and mineral. And what happened in Rutland City? The haloacedic acids levels just dropped. So for a number of years, everything was fine, We're not in violation. Well, now it started to creep back up. Probably pretty predictably that was going to happen. So now it's time to talk about, okay, let's deal with this problem once and for all. And so that's pretty much where we are today. Let me just see if there's anything else I wanted to chat. I think that's about it. That gives us some background. So we're here to look at what are the alternatives to deal with this violation of haloacedic acids. Like I say, 60 parts per billion is the maximum contaminant level that EPA has set as being safe or acceptable for public consumption. The city is generally, locations in the city are below that. There are locations, however, that are above 60 to 70, somewhere in there. And we need to do something about it. So that's why we're here. I think Ted Gillum, the assistant city engineer, is going to talk about that pattern over the years, and then I'll come back and we'll discuss what some alternatives are available to us and what the city is going to recommend.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so just looking back on the last 25 years, so thinking about back in '98, EPA set the guidance for the maximum contaminant level. Again, 60 parts per billion. Just want to try to put that into perspective a little bit, So 60 gallons for every 1 billion gallons, or, thinking about what the water treatment plant produces on any given day, 2 million gallons, 2.5 million gallons. So we're looking at, a goal of keeping these haloacedic acids, under 15 ounces for every 2 million gallons that comes out. So we're dealing with very, very small numbers, maybe 5 ounces in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, or a quarter of a drop of water in your household bathtub. So again, very small numbers, but that just speaks to, how important this issue is and how closely you have to monitor it. You need these specialized laboratories to test these small quantities. So again, so small, but that's how important it is. Just looking back at the 20 plus years of data that has been collected, what we would do to monitor it is we take 4 locations throughout the city, collect samples at each location once per quarter, 4 times a year, and you take an average over the last 4 periods at each location. And if any one of those locational averages, exceeds that 60 parts per billion, well, that triggers the violation. The whole system's in violation. So again, just to recap, 4 locations, 4 times a year, 60 parts per billion, and obviously we've hit that recently. Several quarters in a row, you're receiving those notices in your water bills. But just thinking back the last 20 years, looking back at 2003, as we research the history, we see the numbers came up a little bit. 2004 dropped. We were in compliance, and then there was 6 years in a row, 2005, 2011, where the numbers were high. And like Mark was saying earlier, Hurricane Irene, 2011, 2012, all of a sudden things just drop. Rutland City's in compliance. That just so happened at the same time that the city had just completed the first study for the disinfectant byproducts and came up with all these alternative treatment measures to entertain. And then again, the hurricane came in, things got cleaned up, we didn't have to take action, and we remained in compliant for, the next 11 or 12 years. Just fast forwarding to late last year, we started seeing the numbers starting to creep up, a little abnormal compared to the historical data. So the theory is that all those drainages in the watershed and Mendon Brook, everything, all the growth comes back. We're getting that decayed matter interacting with the chlorine, disinfectant byproducts, numbers start going up. We send out the notices. It peaked in May of this year, but by that time we had already taken action. Again, we were just sampling 4 spots 4 times a year. We decided to ramp it up to 12 locations once per month. Certainly an additional expense, but the idea was to determine whether these were isolated instances. If it was around a dead-end water main, was it water age, or was it something that we could easily handle by just making some minor modifications to the distribution system. But as we ramped up that sampling period, we noticed that it was more widespread than anticipated. There's a lot of variability depending on where you're testing in the city. Some numbers were high, some numbers were low. They'd still vary throughout the season, things like that. But what remained consistent is that we were in violation for multiple quarters in a row. We pair up with EPA, we enter a study, free to the city, to evaluate the system, to come up with some alternatives. We'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah, that's where we're at now. You want to talk about some of those alternatives?
So back just before Tropical Storm Irene, the city hired me when I was working, my consulting firm hired me to do a study to to really look at what the alternatives were. And so that took about probably over a year period. We pilot tested a couple of different processes for a long period of time, and then I did a report and some cost estimates and all that to look at what the alternatives are. And if some of you attended this same kind of meeting back at that time, you would have heard the same thing. We looked at three alternatives. The first is GAC, or granulated activated carbon. Carbon is very effective in removing organic contaminants. And so I looked at how that might be incorporated into the existing treatment process. It would involve large vessels or tanks of activated carbon that the water would pass through that would reduce the disinfection, the dissolved organic matter in the water, and then it would be chlorinated afterwards and head into the city. The primary disinfection, the primary problem with GAC, the first one, is financial. Back then, I estimated it would be, I think, $8 million or so to put that in, and an operating cost of many hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. As Ted said, rather than rely on that study that I did 10 or 12 years ago, whatever, EPA paid for a study that was done just this past year that took a fresh look at the alternatives. They looked at those same alternatives, confirmed that my conclusions at the time were essentially correct, and updated the costs. The current cost for GAC is over $10 million for construction costs and $400,000 a year operating costs. In addition, you have to obviously replace the carbon once it gets used up, and whether or not you can landfill it or it's considered a hazardous waste or whatever we don't know at this point, but it's got to get rid of and replaced. So that's one option. It would be effective. The second option that we pilot tested was an ion exchange process, where water again is passed through a media, an ion exchange media, a resin, where the dissolved organic matter is absorbed. And that process, at a current cost of $6 or $7 million, and a same operating cost, an additional $400,000 a year, it's an extremely complex process. I mean, you can picture a brewery or something like that. Lots of stainless steel equipment, piping, pumps, chemical feed equipment, or feed equipment. Both the GAC and the ion exchange process would require much more operator attention, being at the plant longer periods of time, 7 days a week, potentially around the clock. Would require three-phase power being brought to the site, of which there's no three-phase power there now, and would require pumps where every drop of water gets pumped before it goes to the city. And right now, you have an entirely gravity-fed process. Essentially, right now, the power could get shut off at the water filtration plant, and the city would be uninterrupted for water, and the only power that you technically would need would be a battery or a small generator to run your chlorine feed pump. That's quite an advantage for a municipality of this size, to have a totally gravity-fed system, unreliant on essentially electrical power. So the third alternative, and it's the alternative that I believe the city is going to formally recommend and proceed with, although that's not my decision, is switching to a process that uses monochloramine. chloramines. And chloramines are another form of chlorine. Ammonia sulfate is added to the water before chlorine is added, and it forms a monochloramine. It's a less reactive form of chlorine. It requires more contact time with the water in order to disinfect the water. And because it's less reactive, it tends not to form these disinfection byproducts that we're concerned with. That is a relatively very inexpensive addition, depending on the contact facilities that are needed to be added, whether it's a small tank, whether it's just a large pipe. We're looking at less than $500,000 and maybe $20,000 in additional operating costs. Now, who uses monochloramine? Is this something new? Well, it's not. 100 years ago, I think Denver started to use monochloramines. Right now, I think the majority of the country, as far as large public water systems, use monochloramine for disinfection for this real purpose. Most of the population in New England, I believe, uses monochloramine or drinks water that has monochloramine used for disinfection. Same with Europe. So it's nothing new. It's actually an old form. And Joe Duncan is here from Champlain Water District, right there, from Champlain Water District, because essentially all the communities around Burlington City have used for how many years, Joe?
Since 2006, so 18.
Okay. For 18 years have used monochloramine as a form of disinfection. They get their water directly from Lake Champlain, obviously a source of dissolved organic matter. So those are the options that we've looked at, and there's a vast difference in cost, a vast difference in operational, how complex the operation is, and how high the operation and maintenance costs are going to be. And there are risks involved in all of them. Some of them are mechanical risks. Monochloramine is not without risk. There are, and I'm going to have Joe speak to this as far as some of the precautions. Operating is more complex. Operating using monochloramines is, you have to be more attentive than just using sodium hypochlorite right now. But those risks can be easily managed with proper operation, and you've got an excellent operation up at the water filtration plant now. So that's where we are as far as the options and what they might cost. Let's see, who's next? Okay, so next is Joe Duncan, Champlain Water District, the Executive Director of Champlain Water District, and a professional engineer. And if the city does elect to decide to go to monochloramine disinfection, we're going to use Champlain Water District as a model to follow their example, because they've actually run a terrific process. Their plant is nationally recognized. It's got national awards as far as its operation, and they are a leader in the nation as far as how to treat water and their expertise on staff of treating water.
Thanks, Mark. Joe Duncan, General Manager, Champlain Water District. Great to be here. So yeah, my reason for being here is, as Mark said, is to sort of give a little background on Champlain Water District and how we wound up where we are, and how we are how we've moved forward with chloramines throughout the process and what we do from an operations perspective. 1908 was the first, it was Jersey City, New Jersey. 1908 was the first use of chlorine in the United States. And then in 1928 or 29, it was like Cleveland, Springfield, Ohio, and Denver were the first ones to use chloramine as a disinfectant. And if you know anything about the water world, we don't move very fast. We don't like change. We don't ever want to be the first to do anything. So for us, when we came around to looking at chloramine in the 2004, 2005 timeframe, there's a very well-established protocol for how to utilize that, and I'll kind of walk through a little bit that to give you some reference. So Champlain Water District, as Mark said, we are a wholesale water supplier, so basically we produce water and we sell it to 12 water systems in 9 municipalities to 83,000 people around the city of Burlington. We don't actually sell water to the city of Burlington. They have their own facility. We go from Shelburne up to Milton, out to the village of Jericho. And so for us, back in the early 2000s, we were looking at where the trends for trihalomethanes and haloacedic acids were going, and they were going up. And for us, it's a major issue because we start out at our plant in South Burlington, and then we have several days worth of detention in order to make our way all the way out to Milton, and then all the way out to Jericho, a little less of a run down to Shelburne. So basically, you can imagine with pipes taking their time from our plant all the way out to those places, water gets aged, it gets older. Some of that allows for that capacity of time for the disinfection byproducts to form as free chlorine becomes less stable. So for us, the goal of trying to find a more stable approach was important to us, so we looked at chloramine as an option. As Mark said, did a bunch of the pilot testing along the way to make sure we were in a good place to transition over to it. Made the transition in 2006. We've done a ton of testing leading up to probably the early 2010s, maybe mid 2010s, of testing for all kinds of speciations of DPBs and all kinds of different formations of chloramine byproducts, nitrosamine, NDMA, to kind of prove out that the chloramine was very stable in there. And the thing that you have to know is with any treatment process, you have to understand what your source water quality is, and then you also have to know how to make sure that you're controlling the doses to make the right mixture. You have that issue right now with chloramine or with orthophosphate or anything else you might be putting into there. It's making sure you make the right concoction in that water to have it do what you want it to do and not do something you don't want it to do. And so for us, it's all about process control. And I will say, in the water world, it's not about reinventing the wheel. We spent a lot of time with some of those cities that have already. City of Philadelphia has been using this for a very long time. Massachusetts Water Resources Association, which is basically, if you've ever drank water in Boston, their water comes from the Quabbin all the way out on the central west side of Massachusetts, and that's all chlorinated all the way into the city of Boston. So we spent time with each of those systems trying to understand how do you do it and what do you do, because they've been doing it successfully for many, many years. And for us, it's all about making sure that you have to dose chlorine and ammonia, and making sure that you have several processes in place to make sure that dose is getting to the point where you want it to be. And for us, it's using multiple analyzers for chloramine creation, as well as looking at watching what we're using for dosing. We do it on a volume basis. We do it on a weight basis. We do it on we also do it on a time basis for looking at the weight and the volume. And so essentially we're constantly monitoring that to make sure that mixture is going out there. Then the other thing you have to do is you have to test it both at the plant as well as out in the system. And so some of that system testing is covered when you wind up doing your sampling that's required by the state. But for us, and I think for a lot of the systems we talked to when they first shifted over to chloramine, did more advanced testing just to make sure that they were getting where they needed to be. So for us, that's the kind of stuff that we recommend be done when converting over to that. We are fortunate. We were the first in the nation in the Partnership for Treatment Water Excellence in 1995. We've been that excellence ever since then for the past 20 years. Actually more than that, yeah. 95, yeah, 20-something years, 30 years, whatever it's been. Time goes by too fast. And so we've also won several New England Waterworks awards for the best tasting water in New England. We also won it in 2015 at AWWA as the best People's Choice Best Tasting Water. So, you know, when it comes to taste of water, you know, really it comes down to how are you mixing that? How are you dosing that that ammonia chlorine mixture? Because if you're out of range, you do start to get taste and odor issues with it. So it really, you look to your operators to say, you know, how do we make sure that we hit those marks and create the water blend that you're looking for that gets it out into the system. And so my point to everything here is that, you know, we aren't the be-all end-all of anything, but what we are is we've worked together in the water community, together with people who have worked in the water community for many years, and there are resources available to the city of Rutland to understand how to make that conversion to chloramine and do so and get themselves set up to be successful in making that happen. That's sort of my message here, and you know, we're happy to be a resource to the city if this does move forward. So,
Could you speak to any reports of how you dealt with any health concerns or the public's comments as far as they're concerned health-wise?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly a world of if you have aquaculture or if you have dialysis, you certainly are going to have to make sure you're communicating with those users, because dialysis is essentially stripping out everything because it goes directly into your bloodstream. But when it comes to just a general health and wellness, we had people with concerns about what the effects of chloramine might be to them, whether it's rashes or airborne breathing. We work very closely with the Department of Health at that time, with anyone that came in that had a concern, working with them directly to get them to the Department of Health, suggesting that they go and they meet with their health professionals. And to date, we've never had any, and that's settled down. I would say we probably in the first 5-6 years, we had a lot of questions and concerns, and I don't think we've had a call on chloramines in the past 5 years with anyone with any health concerns. But you know, for us, if there is, we've directed them to the Department of Health, and to date, we don't have anything that's been reported as connecting any of those health concerns to the drinking water supply. So. And so next up, what I'll do is introduce Josh Gravlin. He's with the state of Vermont, and he'll give his perspective on the state's position.
Thanks, Joe. So my name is Josh Gravlin, and I'm a compliance analyst with the state, so I'm in charge of managing the DBP rule for the state. So I monitor all the public water systems that disinfect their water and just kind of monitor the DBP levels and issue violations when those levels are exceeded. So what I want to do is just spend a couple of minutes discussing past compliance with the disinfection byproduct rule. So prior to the recent round of maximum contaminant level violations, or MCL exceedances that started in the fall of '23, the water system had gone through a roughly 10-year period without exceeding the MCL for total haloacedic acids, which I don't want to spend too much time rehashing what's already been discussed, but you know, historically the water system struggled with total haloacedic acids since the implementation of stage 2 disinfection byproduct rule back in 2006. But ultimately, these levels dropped significantly post-Hurricane Irene for reasons that were already discussed. The last 10-year period is marked by a noticeable return to pre-Irene conditions. You can just take a look at the data and see that slow climb back up. From a compliance perspective, the water system's met all of the obligations required of it that were caused by the recent MCL exceedances. It's pursued technical assistance through Water TA, a free program from the EPA. It's published public notice in a timely fashion, remains responsive to state inquiries, and has been forthright in providing regular updates on progress it has made in identifying potential treatment changes and implementing whichever change is selected. In the end, the state doesn't really have a preferred method of addressing disinfection byproducts so long as what is pursued is effective at bringing the water quality back down reliably and consistently below the MCL. Any change beyond what the city's already really tried here is going to require a permit from the state, and at that time, it'll be designed and reviewed by engineers. Once the city decides on a path forward and submits a permit application to our office, there'll be a public notice process and the ability to request a hearing, and any comments received will be considered when drafting the permit. And I kind of want to leave you with this thought. So I don't get to cheerlead water systems very often. The nature of my position requires that I ensure systems stay on track with federal and state rule. I'm really kind of thrilled to be able to stand here and tell you that you have a great team taking care of your water. They really do care. And, I think that everybody should know that. It's important to me that people know that. And, I'd be thrilled to have them here. And, Joe Duncan and Champlain Water District do a fantastic job. They're pretty much a model in the state. So that's really all I have to offer. And I'd like to pass it over to Bridget O'Brien from the Vermont Department of Health.
Thanks, Josh. Hi, I am Bridget O'Brien. I'm a toxicologist at the Health Department. I don't have long prepared remarks this evening, but similar to what Josh said, we are supportive of these efforts to reduce the disinfection byproducts, specifically the HAAs here. They are carcinogenic, and that's why we are trying to reduce them in the water. But if there are any further follow-up questions, I'm happy to take those as we open this up.
Hi, everyone. So I am Janelle Wilbur, and I work for the state of Vermont as well in the Drinking Water and Groundwater Protection Division. So I oversee the compliance section. So Josh and I work together collectively to implement drinking water regulations both on the federal and state level. So I'm also here more so if there were any programmatic or regulatory questions that you may have, I'm happy to jump in and answer those, and we can talk through what the process is when an MCL is exceeded and the deadlines and corrective actions that we then require. I will say that as a division, we oversee roughly 100 regulated contaminants at this point, and as you can imagine, as the science develops and as new studies come out and new toxicological numbers come out, that we have ever increasing regulations that are coming at us. And I don't mean us, the state, I mean us as in all of us here. We're always finding out new things. And part of, I will mention briefly, the EPA process. So we also implement the federal regulations under EPA. We have primacy to implement the regulations under EPA. And part of that is monitoring for known compounds, such as disinfection byproducts, but also unregulated compounds. And so every year or so, in a 3-year cycle, the EPA will require monitoring for certain brackets of water systems for certain contaminants that might be, the science is just developing, and we're trying to gather more information so that new potential regulations can come down the pike. So with that, I think we'll take questions, perhaps? All right. Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Thank you, panel, for all that interesting information. We're now going to open up this session to questions from you, the audience. If anybody would wish to ask a question, simply raise your hand. I will bring the microphone to you. You will be able to ask your question, and hopefully one of our panel members will be able to answer it for you. Who would like to go first?
Thanks for the presentations. It's good information. Can you remind me what the MCL is, what the recent high readings have been for Rutland, and how that compares to what the highs were prior to Irene?
Yeah, so the recent numbers were around 63 parts per billion, different for each locational average. Just looking at the past 20 years pre-Irene, we saw numbers that were much higher than that seasonally, I remember seeing, so we'll use it in a decimal instead of parts per billion, you know. So now we're at 0.063, say in some spots. I was seeing numbers at 0.1 plus, you know, at its highest. But usually it's, yeah, or 100, yeah. So usually it's 60s or 70s, you know, things like that. That was fairly common for quite a while pre-Irene. So, you know, again, you always see it come up in the spring, you know, with high runoff, and then it drops down. So when it drops, we could see them at, you know, in the 20s or 30s or 40s and things like that. That was what was common for the 10 years following Irene. Yep. Sure.
One thing that's an interesting perspective, it's not really relevant to what we're talking about right now, but when I mentioned that since 1910, the city just added chlorine to the Mendon Brook, actually chlorinated at the intake of Mendon Brook, and then chlorinated again before it went into the city. They chlorinated the intake in order to try and prevent algae from building in the reservoir, and then chlorinated again before it went into the city. And when I think about what the disinfection byproducts that we were creating back then, I don't even know what those numbers might be. Now, obviously, we didn't know what disinfection byproducts were, but we were basically chlorinating brook water prior to any filtration, and obviously the numbers were much, much higher. So, for what it's worth, it just so we're talking about bringing those levels from wherever they were since 1910 to 1995, now dancing between 60 and 100 parts per billion down to way below 60.
Anyone else? Would someone like to ask a question? And I forgot to mention, I'm sorry, this is John McCain, one of our aldermen. I ask that you identify yourself and please give us your place of residence.
Hi, Elise Headlam, and I live in Rutland. And I had a question for Josh. I was wondering if you have any information, if there are any communities within your district or that you know of in the state that are using the chloramine that have suffered from the recent floods, and if so, what kind of an impact does that have if we already have chloramine in our system?
Josh from the state or from me from Champlain Water District?
From the state.
Yeah. There you go, Josh.
Thank you. So we actually don't have any other systems that are using chloramines that are community systems that have been using it for a while that we would have been able to sit back and analyze any real data on that. But looking at Burlington and looking at the rest, or looking at Champlain Water District and comparing the data from them to the data of many of the other systems that are on the lake, you could see a pretty clear rise in many of the systems on the lake over the last several years. Champlain Water District has not really experienced the same rise in DBPs that have been associated with that other systems have had. So when I talk about the lake systems, what we're seeing, and Ray Solomon, who's sitting over the front there, might be able to speak to this more, but the floods and the heavy rains that we've experienced over the last 2 years, you know, without saying definitively that they are adding all sorts of organic materials to the lake via runoff, that's kind of where our head is at, you know, that they have contributed a large amount of organic matter to the lakes, and that we are seeing that play out in the systems on the lakes in DBP formations. As we spoke to, you know, adding chlorine to your system creates opportunity for chlorine to react with those organic compounds and form DBPs. And so we've seen elevated DBP levels all along the lake and other surface water systems as a result of what we believe is a result of the floods and heavier rains. And we continue to see some of those high levels, especially on some of the river systems right now. But yeah, we did not see those out of Champlain Water District.
Maybe you could address that. You're
Any other questions?
I can
Oh, I'm
respond to
sorry.
that. So as to kind of play off of what Josh was saying, Champlain Water District gets its water out of Shelburne Bay. Shelburne Bay is a very large trillion gallons worth of water type of environment, and we're grabbing it from a very up 80 feet down on the lake. But what we normally see is about 0.1 NTU of turbidity, which is not necessarily dissolved organics, but it is an indicator of the organic matter and the quantity of organic matter that's there. For the past several years, we've been seeing spikes that have lasted where we've had almost like the new norm has become 1 to 2 NTU, which may not sound like a lot, but essentially that's a large multiplier factor higher. And we haven't seen any of those increases in DPB, in the high trihalomethanes and HAA sampling that we've done in the system. So essentially, my view of it is we've been able to be more resilient with our disinfection byproduct formation by having chloramine as a disinfectant compared to free chlorine. I can say our counterpart, the city of Burlington, gets their water just around the corner from us in Lake Champlain. They've seen a similar water pattern where they are seeing increased turbidities and increased dissolved organics. And as a result, they are seeing their THMs and HAAs creep up where we are not. So to me, that's an indicator that that chloramine is a little bit more resilient to those washouts that occur, which unfortunately, whatever your belief is in climate change, the reality is we are getting more frequent heavy rainstorms that create these washouts. Those washouts, picking specifically for Rutland, may clean out your water tributary, but all that stuff is going to wind up in your reservoir, and that then would be needed to be taken. That additional dissolved organics needs to be dealt with. So my view of it is that the chloramine use will be more resilient to that DPB formation, if that answers your question.
Anyone else would like to ask a question?
Jack Crowther from Rutland. Are there no health concerns about the effect of chloramine on health?
So chloramine is a pretty well-studied chemical. So monochloramine is what we're talking about here. That's what we're trying to make in the system. And assuming the system is running smoothly, that's what's going to come out. And it really is not a toxic moiety. It's not a toxic compound. There have been some reports, as Joe was alluding to, when they first switched over, reporting skin irritation and that kind of stuff. Dermal effects, but it would appear, and I think the best study to point to this is really when San Francisco switched their water system over. They highly publicized that they were making this switch, encouraged people to report any symptoms, and really within that study, only about 70 people reported out of about 2.5 million folks, and so that, to me, that says if there is some kind of sensitization there, that folks are going to have an effect of chloramine, because I'm not saying that's out of the realm of possibility, that is a very small chance there for that to happen here.
Would anyone else like?
So, I'm Sharon Davis. I sit on the Board of Aldermen. I'm going to ask Ted if he could publicly, folks that are here, folks that are watching, talk about what you shared with the board, that our water is safe, and what the exposure would have to be currently for us to have any concern. How much consumption, et cetera, that you talked about.
I think the studies that have been done, the concern is over, several years or a lifetime of exposure of consistently, drinking that water. So that's, by no means we want to minimize this. We've got to nip this in the bud quick. and not dance around it. But, it is carcinogenic, over several years, again, over a lifetime. There are some possibilities that could come up. But again, it's an important matter, and we have to clean it up.
I'm not sure if this may answer your question. In an EPA report, when they were setting the maximum contaminant limit, and these studies, this is based, as my understanding is, this is based on lots of testing on laboratory animals, and then also looking at then what the human impact might be based on those tests. So studies, testing on animals, studies on human, on what the human impact would be. And when the MCL, or the maximum contaminant level, is set, it was set to estimate that 3 persons out of every 1,000 persons would have a illness, whether that be cancer or some other illness, for drinking the water for a lifetime of exposure. So that's the statistic that I've seen published, is 3 persons out of 1,000 lifetime of drinking the water. So maybe other people have other information, but that's what I read from the EPA study. So. Yeah.
Tom Garofano, I'm the Chief Operator and Distribution Manager. Sharon, if it wasn't safe to drink, Josh would be calling me right away and telling me to issue a do not drink order, correct? So the water is still safe to drink. That being said, we are tasked to move forward to remedy this issue.
I think there's been a lot of public comment and concern shared with us, and I think folks just need to understand that it's a long-term exposure. It's a long-term, I think Ted talked about multiple gallons per day that you would be drinking, and knowing that we're just moving forward to clear up this issue. Thank you. Thanks.
Would anyone else like to ask a question?
Thanks, Joe. Again, John McCann, also on the Board of Aldermen here. Has there been any discussion looking at a different source of water? So would going to groundwater be in the realm of possibility, or where does that fall kind of cost-wise, right? So to rule that out. And then also, if there's a seasonality in the presence or the concentrations of the haloacedic acids, is there a seasonality in the potential treatment? We're talking about operating costs annually. Can we reduce that by some amount by only using the chloramine during those times when it's necessary?
The first question, is there another source of water? The answer is really no. The city uses 2 to 2.5 million gallons a day, and there isn't a potential groundwater source. We don't have a very deep sand gravel aquifer like Brandon does, where we might get 2.5 million gallons a day out of the water. So that's actually the city, again, a little bit of sidetrack. The city actually did look for a groundwater source before the water filtration plant was built, and actually tried to develop in Mendon a deep gravel well, and there was water there. There was several hundred gallons a minute, but not a couple thousand gallons a minute, which is what we need. So the second question, I suspect that once a process is put in place, it'll be operated year-round. It's probably pretty difficult to try and chase the result by taking a process on and off and on and off line. So it would be a full-time process, yeah.
Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question?
I'd like to ask Bridget or anybody who could talk about the studies that have shown that people who are exposed to monochloramine get respiratory problems, that it can happen from showering. You can get it from the air that you breathe. And I know from personal experience swimming in swimming pools that I had a pretty significant impact. I used to get bronchitis every year.
Thanks. Yeah, so one important thing that I don't think we've really delved into tonight is there are different types of chloramines. So there's monochloramine, dichloramine, and trichloramine. What you're generally seeing in swimming pools is trichloramine, and that is volatile, and you can breathe that in, and it's known to be a strong irritant. What Rutland would have to do here is to control their water chemistry, because in a well-controlled system, you're not going to see so that's not likely to be a problem here. But I mean, the water does need to be well controlled, and that water chemistry needs to be well managed.
Anyone else?
I'm Billy Gillum from Rutland City. I'm also on the Board of Aldermen. If you pick item C, how long will it take to put that system in place? What's the time frame once we vote for it?
That's a question that the state asked, and as we've been discussing these options with them, we're looking at the end of 2026 as a schedule to have whatever solution in place.
So what do we do from now until then? Are we on a heavy monitoring system with the state and everything else to keep us safe?
Bill, we're on the same monitoring schedule right now. So what's going to happen is we just took samples last week, okay, quarterly. We'll take them next quarter, and the next quarter, and the next quarter, until we until we implement whatever systems chose. And you will be getting a notification, and public notice will come out every quarter, just like it has for the past 4 quarters. So you'll continue to be getting the same notifications until we come back into compliance. All right?
Anyone else? Would anyone else?
To follow up on your question, what happens if it really goes up high in between before you get 2026?
So we're out of compliance now. We are out of compliance. Yep. We have reached the MCL, the maximum contaminant level. We're above 60. There isn't, how do I put this, any more time in the penalty box, if you will, if you go to 70, correct? Or to 80, or to 90, or God forbid 100. There isn't any. But that's why we've stepped on the gas a little bit, trying to get, now 2026 seems like a long ways away, but it's not. We still need to file permits with the state. The plans need to go to review, and we need to start construction. Construction for number C, as Bill said, much faster. Probably talking months instead of years to put it together. If you're talking a GAC system, Mark, I mean, that's major construction. And not to mention a lot of money. I hope that answers your question.
So what is the number that you would say you can't drink the water? Is there any such number? No.
There is not. It's not considered
Anyone else?
I just have a question. Sorry.
That's all right.
I just want to know, what is the life expectancy of using chloramine? Is this something that if we spend the money and we start putting this in and we start changing our status of people who are working in our water district, are we expecting that in 5 years or 10 years we're going to have to look at this again and maybe come up with one of these other solutions?
I'll just field the question. Maybe Joe could answer your experience as far as Champlain Water District, what your levels were before and what they are now, and how you see into the future them just staying, operating as you are now.
Yeah, it all comes down to what's going on with your source and how that affects it. But, you know, if assuming a stable source, that system should be viable for, you know, a very long time. And there's equipment that you're going to purchase, and that equipment is monitoring equipment and whatnot. So you're going to have to reinvest in some of that. But getting away from the process of chlorination or monochloramines, there would be no reason to move into a different one. Obviously, the permitting landscape is a shifting environment, but from what I can see, when you look back, and disinfection has been in play for well over 100 years, and chloramine has been a part of that for almost 100 of that. I don't see us getting away from that, and I would imagine if the city of Rutland went in this direction, I don't see the city needing to make a shift away from using monochloramine for disinfectants. It is a very stable compound, and I think you'd be well buffered with whatever might be going on with the environment over time. Does that answer your question? Okay.
No, and one thing that has changed over the years, you know, Tom and his staff monitor the quality of the water that gets into the reservoir, where before the intake from the brook just came into the reservoir 365 days a year. Whatever the brook was given came right into the reservoir and right down to your tap. Now, if it rains, either automatically or Tom, through his cell phone, shuts the intake off. You're drinking water then right out of the reservoir, which is very clean, very clear. After the brook is cleared up, then the intake is turned back on. So there's actually instrumentation right at the intake that will automatically close the valve if the brook gets too riled up. Or at any time, the operators can shut that intake off. So it's really well managed. So that, again, trying to reduce. Okay. Trying to reduce those dissolved organic compounds, and just really managing the water system as efficiently as possible for water quality.
To touch on what Mark had said, we have been very proactive over the past few years, really, as we started to see our DVP levels creep up. Even before we got our first OEL, we've started shutting the intake down, so we weren't accepting water from the river into the reservoir even before a rainstorm. You know, if we knew a rainstorm was coming along, we didn't want the dissolved organics in. So it helped us out for quite some time, and I'm convinced if we still continue to receive water through a rainstorm that's highly turbid, our DVP numbers would be much higher than they are right now. So we're very proactive. We also monitor ultraviolet absorbance. It's a precursor for disinfectant byproducts. And we'll take a grab sample prior to opening to make sure we're under 0.1. Because that seems kind of like the sweet spot that keeps us a little bit low. We won't open up unless the inlet is below 3 NTUs, and it's typically under 0.1 NTU. Like today it was 0.3. So we're pretty low turbid water, and we try to accept only the highest quality all the time. For a number of years we stayed in compliance doing that. Just trying to be proactive that way. To answer your question, though, I think what you were hinting at was, will we have to do some other type of treatment? This isn't the silver bullet for any other contaminant that happens, okay? If you have a PFAS or you have arsenic or any other issue in your water, that's another conversation that we'll be here for, hopefully never. But this will help with our disinfectant byproduct issue. Does that help you out with?
If we used one of these other systems, if we use the GAC or the ion process, would that change that? Is one of those better?
I'm not going to speak to whether one is better than the other. They all have their pros and cons, right? But yes, GAC is effective in removing PFOA, PFAS issues. There's other issues that carbon can bring into it if it's not conditioned properly or the type of carbon that you acquire. There can be some iron issues and even some arsenic from the carbon that can come out of it. There's challenges, to be completely honest, there's challenges with any treatment change, right, that you go with.
The one thing to say is that, the one thing to add to that is, I'll give you that. The one thing to say to that is that it's simpler is better. And, you know, I don't know if your point might have been, hey, you know, GAC covers a wide range of potential future contaminants. So maybe that's something to consider at this point in time. And obviously, I think if you had, you know, if you had something else going on, you might want to look in that world, but you don't. So when you also look at time and resources, and obviously it's something the city has to make a judgment on. Champlain Water District, we took a look at it and said, this is a cost-effective measure that's going to get us where we need to be with our disinfectant today. We also took a look to say, is it going to hinder us if there are things that come down the line for processes? And from our search of everything, there isn't anything that we identified that says, if we do this today, we're going to have to dismantle all this and go do something completely different. You know, you can add a GAC system if you want, you know, and still have chloramination. Those are worlds that you can live within. And when you look at it, what is the right investment at the time? And I think the city, talking to Tommy over the years and Mark, the thought is if we are going to do something today, is that going to keep us from doing something tomorrow? And I think that's been the mindset that I've heard from them over the years, and that's something that we look at, and that's why you looking at monochloramine was a non-issue for us, because it does fit within a variety of other schemes if you have to add on other potential treatment processes. And that's sort of our take on it.
Anyone else? If not, I'm going to close the question and answer session at this time, and I will offer up to the panel closing statements if they would like, if there's anyone who would like to make a closing statement.
I'm not going to make a closing statement except to invite all of you to go up to the water filtration plant, and Tommy will give you a tour, a personal tour of and you'll really get a good sense of how this water system is operated. It's easy for us to sit here and talk it, and it may or may not make a lot of sense, some of the terminology we use. But if you go to the water filtration plant and he brings you to the intake and you see where the water comes from, and then you go through the filtration plant itself and you look at how it's managed and how it's monitored, you'll come away with a really incredible confidence that your water is really well managed and the water quality that you're drinking is better than it's ever been.
I'll say too, Mark, that the offer has stood for Tommy and the Rutland City crew to come up anytime to take a look at our facility. So if there is anybody that's ever up in the South Burlington area that wants to come check out our facility, we're happy to give a tour. And the other thing I'll say too is this is, you know, we're here, Champlain Water District is here because it's something that we worked through tirelessly back in 2006 to get to the point where we were putting it in. 18 years later, I think it's been very successful and very positive for our users at a very low cost to implement. And I think the city has all the tools in place to follow that and make that work with the skill set of operators that they have. So to me, there's a high level of confidence in the city being able to do what they need to do if you do go down the chloramination route.
That being said,
I'm just going to say one more thing. Since I came all the way here, I thought I'd just spend a couple of minutes with you. My name is Ray Solomon. I work for the DEC Drinking Water Program, and I have a very long history with all of the surface water systems in the state of Vermont. For many, many years, I've rendered, as best I could, technical assistance to all these systems, and one of them being Rutland, obviously. I just want to say that in all the years that I've worked, and it's been many, many years, the City of Rutland has always been giving me great cooperation on all the suggestions I've ever made to them. They've followed through on them. Hopefully, going to chloramination, we're going to work once again together, and don't be afraid of what Rutland will be doing when they chloraminate. They'll have our full support, and we will attempt to the best of our ability to make sure that when you do chloraminate, that the water that comes through is monochlorinated, not dichloraminated, not trichloraminated, not have a lot of excess ammonia, not have excess nitrite, not have excess nitrate. It's a more complicated process, but nevertheless, I think I have full confidence in Tom, and I think we'll really get the job done well. And as you mentioned, is this the be-all and end-all? Well, you have to remember, when it comes to drinking water, new things are found all the time. The latest is this PFAS business. And so we can never say, this is the end of it. We can't say that. But what we can say for chloramination is it's a reasonable method of dealing with the problem that you have right now. The thing about chlorine is that when it combines with organic material, it just reacts and reacts and reacts. It's not like it reacts for a minute and then it goes through. It's reacting all the way through your entire process, from the time you put it in, go through your distribution storage, go through all your pipeline. It's building those disinfectant byproducts. And with chloramination, as soon as you convert from chlorine to chloramine, you stop that process. You essentially stop it. And so that's why it works so well. But nevertheless, I don't want to give you a pie in the sky or get your hopes up, because maybe not in your lifetime or my lifetime, but in somebody's lifetime, something new is going to come up. And the systems, all the systems, will have to deal with it. Thank you.
I want to thank the ladies and gentlemen of the panel for all this valuable information to the residents of Rutland City. This concludes our forum for the night. Please feel free to come back Wednesday, November 20th, if you wish to ask any additional questions, or if you simply want to hear more. But please note, on November 20th, the session will start at 7 p.m., not 6 p.m., and the session will be held here at the Recreation Center. If you folks at home have questions, you can contact us through the website tedg@rutlandcity.org, or call 802-773-1800, extension 223. And Ted will see that the appropriate member of the panel gets the question answered for you and gets it back to you. That being said, I want to thank you all for coming. Please have a safe drive home and have a good night. Thank you.